When I was growing up, our home felt like a military camp. My father, a college professor, ran our household like a strict ship captain, and no one dared to defy his rigid orders. Family dinners resembled a ritual. Every fork, knife, and spoon lay perfectly in place, and every phrase was measured to the letter. Sarah, my older sister, embodied the ideal child. Her diligence was an art form, her smile could soften even my father's sternest gaze, and her behavior never drew our mother's disapproval. It seemed as though she lived solely to serve as a role model for me, but her perfection only highlighted my alienation from the rest of the family. I was the complete opposite of Sarah. The joker, that's what they called me at home. The one who pushed boundaries, challenged traditions, and tested my parents' patience. Abigail, sit up straight, my father barked at me during dinner. His voice resembled a senior officer's command, and I instinctively straightened up, only to slouch again as soon as his gaze shifted. It was my small victory in our ongoing battle of wills. My mother, on the other hand, never raised her voice. Her disapproval manifested in silence, pursed lips, and icy glares. Her favorite phrase was, "What will the neighbors think?" She frowned upon my colorful outfits, loud friends, and rare attempts to stand out from the crowd. Yet her silence often weighed heavier than my father's shouts. This atmosphere of suffocating control was torture for me. But even in such conditions, I managed to carve out a fragment of freedom. I met Jake when I was 16. He was 3 years older, in college, and everything about him was the opposite of what my parents expected. We hid our meetings like conspirators, stealing moments of happiness in a small park outside the city. These moments felt like a breath of fresh air, proof that beyond the confines of our rigid home lay a more vibrant and spirited world. I had plans. I dreamed of going to college, breaking free from the chains of parental expectations, and finding independence. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. A few months after my 18th birthday, I experienced morning sickness for the first time. At first, I blamed it on the stress of exams, but my suspicions grew stronger. The day I found myself in a tiny gas station restroom was a turning point. In my hands was a pregnancy test, and 2 bright pink lines appeared. Those few millimeters of plastic changed my life forever. I stared at them for a long time, unable to believe what was happening. With trembling hands, I hid the test in my bag and stepped outside, feeling as though my world was crumbling around me. The next few days passed in a haze as I tried to figure out what to do. I knew I had to tell Jake, but every time I dialed his number, I lost my nerve. Finally, I mustered the courage. We met in our secluded park, where we usually spent our evenings. Jake greeted me with a broad smile, but his expression fell as soon as he saw my face. "Abigail, what's wrong?" he asked, reaching out to hug me. I pulled away, wrapping my arms around myself. "I'm pregnant," I said in a trembling voice, staring at the ground. For a few moments, the silence was deafening. Jake looked at me, his face cycling through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, fear. "Are you sure?" he finally asked. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "I took 3 tests. All positive." His response hit me like a punch to the gut. He ran his hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze, and then coldly said, "You need to get rid of it." "An abortion, Abigail. It's the only way. We're too young. This will ruin our lives." I couldn't believe my ears. Jake, my Jake, the one I thought was my rock, was saying these things. His words felt like a death sentence. Anger and pain flared up inside me, and I hissed, "Get out of my sight." He left without another word, leaving me alone in the park with my thoughts. But this was just the beginning of my journey, a journey that would lead me to the most difficult decision of my life. I knew I had to tell my parents. I waited until evening, watching the everyday events of our household unfold like clockwork. After dinner, my father settled into his favorite chair in the living room, his eyes scanning an open newspaper. My mother, engrossed in her knitting, sat nearby. Sarah, as usual, floated silently around the room, radiating an aura of calm and diligence. The atmosphere was both familiar and oppressive, as it always was before a serious conversation. A lump formed in my throat as I gathered the courage to speak. Approaching them, I said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." My voice trembled as though from the cold, but I tried to sound firm. My father slowly lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowing in suspicion as he studied my face, as if trying to predict what was coming. "What is it, Abigail?" he said calmly, though tension was already evident in his voice. I took a deep breath, summoning the last of my resolve. "I'm pregnant," the words spilled out like a death sentence. For a moment, silence engulfed the room. Then my father's face turned red, like a ripened tomato, and he exploded. His shouts filled the space, a torrent of words about the shame and disappointment I had brought upon our family. My mother dropped her knitting, tears streaming down her face. She began to sob and wail, "What will the neighbors think? How will we face people now?" Sarah stood nearby, her expression a mix of shock and disgust, but not a word escaped her lips. When my father finally calmed down enough to speak coherently, his words came like a final decree: "You will have an abortion. We'll find a suitable clinic, and no one will ever know about this mistake." I tried to argue, but the relentless pressure from my family broke me. A few days later, I found myself in a sterile doctor's office. My mother and Sarah sat beside me like prison guards, monitoring my every move. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with a kind face and gentle eyes, flipped through my medical records, her brow furrowed. She looked up at me and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Abigail, I need to tell you something important. Given your medical history and certain risk factors, if you go through with the abortion, there's a high likelihood that you won't be able to have children in the future." Her words hit me like a thunderclap. I felt the ground shift beneath me. My head spun, but in that moment, everything became clear. The decision made itself. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm not going to do it. I'm keeping this baby." My mother gasped, and Sarah rolled her eyes, but I stood firm. On the drive home, the silence in the car was suffocating. Only the sound of tires against the pavement broke the oppressive stillness. When we got back home, my father was waiting for us in the living room. His face darkened when he met my gaze. "Well?" he demanded, and my mother, unable to contain herself, shouted, "She refused. After everything we've done for her." My father's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" He stopped, took a deep breath, and then spoke again, his voice cold and calculated. "Leave," he said. "Pack your things and get out of this house. You are no longer my daughter. I won't let you disgrace this family with your condition." My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes filled with contempt. "You heard your father. Get out." Sarah remained silent, standing off to the side, her face an unreadable mask. Tears streamed down my face, but I said nothing. I ran to my room, grabbed the first bag I could find, and began stuffing clothes into it. As I reached the door, my father called out one last time, "And don't think about coming back. As far as we're concerned, you're dead to us." The sound of the door slamming behind me felt as final as his words. I stood outside the house that had once been mine, now alien and hostile. I was alone, pregnant, and homeless. In desperation, I dialed the only person I thought could help me, my Aunt Linda. She and her husband Bob had always been the black sheep of the family, living in another state and rarely interacting with my parents. "Abigail, what's wrong, sweetheart?" Aunt Linda's voice broke through my sobs, her tone both concerned and soothingly warm. It took me a long time to gather my thoughts. The words spilled out between tears, incoherent at first, but eventually I managed to tell her everything: how I'd been kicked out, my parents' reaction, and my decision to keep the baby. Each word felt like it was pulling the last bit of strength from me. When I finished, there was silence. "Where are you now?" Linda finally asked. "Outside the house," I replied, my voice trembling. "They threw me out." There was another pause, and then her voice became firmer. "Stay there. We're coming to get you." I sat on the steps of what used to be my home, feeling the cold of the night seep into my bones as I gazed up at the stars. Their indifferent twinkling seemed to mirror how small and lost I felt. But I knew Linda and Bob wouldn't abandon me. The drive to their house was long, giving me plenty of time to think about everything that had happened. I watched the lights of passing streets blur through the car window, trying to imagine what lay ahead. Their home was modest but immediately felt like a sanctuary. Linda, the moment we stepped inside, switched into nurturing mode, wrapping me in a blanket and insisting I eat. Uncle Bob silently carried my bag to a spare room, which would now be mine. "It's not much," he said, setting the bag down by the bed. "But it's yours for as long as you need." I looked around the room. The walls were painted a soft pastel color, and a small desk by the window was perfectly positioned to catch the morning light. A lump formed in my throat. "It's perfect," I whispered, tears of gratitude welling up. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I visited doctors, started planning for my future, and adjusted to my new life. One evening over dinner, Linda brought up an unexpected topic. "Bob and I have been thinking," she began, carefully placing her napkin on her lap. "We want to help you continue your education." I stared at her in astonishment. "What do you mean?" I asked, barely finding my voice. Bob, seated across from me, leaned forward, his expression serious. "We've saved some money over the years. We never had kids of our own, so we thought we could use it to help you get into college." I didn't know what to say. After everything that had happened, the idea of pursuing my dreams seemed impossible. "I don't know how to thank you," I began, feeling my heart swell with gratitude. "Just say yes," Linda smiled. "We believe in you, Abigail. This baby doesn't mean the end of your dreams." With their support, I enrolled in a local college to study business administration. It wasn't easy. Classes, doctor's appointments, and the growing discomfort of pregnancy left me drained, but I was determined to make it work. I also found a job as a waitress at a local restaurant. The owner, a kind woman named Maria, was understanding of my situation and flexible with my schedule. It wasn't much, but it allowed me to start saving money for the baby and contribute a little to Linda and Bob's household. The day my son was born was the most terrifying and wonderful day of my life. After hours of labor, I finally held him in my arms, marveling at his tiny fingers and curly lashes. Linda and Bob stood nearby, beaming with pride like newly minted grandparents. "What are you going to name him?" Linda asked softly, her voice trembling with emotion. I looked at my son's peaceful face as he slept in my arms. "Daniel," I said. "It means God is my judge. Because no matter what others think, I know I made the right choice." Motherhood proved to be a tough challenge, especially while juggling school and work. There were nights when I collapsed from exhaustion, trying to soothe Daniel back to sleep before returning to my textbooks. Sometimes, I found myself thinking about my parents and Sarah. Had they heard about my son's birth? Did they regret their decision to disown me? But I pushed those thoughts away. I had a new family now, Linda and Bob. They accepted me unconditionally, flaws and all. One rare moment of respite, I was scrolling through social media when a post caught my attention. It was from Sarah. My heart sank as I began to read, excited to announce that Jake and I are engaged. "Can't wait to start our life together." The photo showed Sarah glowing, her arm wrapped around the very same Jake who had once abandoned me and our child. They looked happy, carefree, as though nothing had happened, as though Daniel and I had never existed in their world. I stared at the screen, a wave of emotions crashing over me: anger, pain, betrayal. But then I looked at Daniel, who was happily playing in his crib. His soft laughter filled the room, and I realized I didn't need their approval or their love. Everything that truly mattered was right here with me. The years flew by in a whirlwind of diapers, textbooks, late-night study sessions, and endless responsibilities. My final semester of college was particularly grueling. I took on extra courses to finish on time while working at the restaurant, caring for an energetic 3-year-old Daniel, and squeezing in rare hours of sleep. On graduation day, I stood in line, waiting for my turn to receive my diploma. The crowd around me buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Scanning the audience, I spotted Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob. They were glowing with pride, waving at me. Daniel sat on Uncle Bob's shoulders, waving his little hands frantically, trying to catch my eye. Walking across the stage to receive my diploma was a moment of triumph I would never forget. But the real surprise came later at the celebration Linda and Bob had planned for me. A small party with banners and balloons filled our home with laughter and warmth. It was there, amidst the toasts and congratulations, that Maria, my boss, pulled me aside. "Abigail, I have a proposition for you," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "What kind of proposition?" I asked, intrigued. "I'm looking for a new restaurant manager, and I think you're perfect for the job," she said with a smile. I was stunned. "But I'm just a waitress," I began, unsure how to respond. "You're so much more than just a waitress," Maria countered, waving her hand dismissively. "I've watched you handle difficult customers, organize staff, and juggle work, school, and motherhood. You have all the skills I'm looking for in a manager." The offer was a dream come true. A stable job, better pay, and a more manageable schedule meant a fresh start for me and Daniel. I eagerly accepted. The next few years were a whirlwind of positive changes. I threw myself into my new role, learning everything I could about business and management. Daniel started school, blossoming into a curious and energetic boy. He loved reading books and was passionate about playing baseball. It was at one of his Little League games that I met Tom. He stood by the sideline, watching the game. His son Michael was on the opposing team. We struck up a conversation, and I was immediately drawn to his kind eyes and light, genuine laugh. "Single dad?" I asked, noticing he was alone. Tom nodded, a faint, sad smile crossing his face. "A widower," he admitted. "Michael's mom passed away when he was very little." My heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry," I said sincerely. "That must be incredibly hard." "It is," he said, his smile tinged with quiet sorrow. "But we're managing." "And you?" "Single mom." I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled too. "You've got the same look I do." Exhaustion mixed with pride. Our conversation flowed naturally, effortlessly. It felt as though I had met someone who, despite walking a completely different path, understood life's struggles and joys in a way few others could. Tom and I took our relationship slowly, and it was the right choice for both of us. We both knew what it was like to be hurt, to endure loss and disappointment, and now we had to consider not just ourselves but our children too. Every step was cautious and thoughtful, yet with each passing month, I felt myself growing closer to this man. Tom was kind, patient, a great listener, and he understood me in a way no one else ever had. Daniel adored him, and Michael became more than just another boy from a different family. We became a unit. A year later, Tom proposed. It wasn't a grand, theatrical gesture, no fancy restaurants or rings hidden in champagne glasses. It happened quietly in his backyard. We were sitting together, watching our boys play on the grass. He simply took my hand and said, "I want us to be a family. A real family." There was no hesitation in his eyes, and I smiled as I replied, "Yes." Our wedding was small but filled with warmth. Only our closest friends and family attended. I remember walking down the aisle, holding Daniel's hand. He proudly served as the ring bearer, his little face glowing with seriousness and the importance of the moment. When I glanced at Aunt Linda, I saw her wiping away tears, her smile brighter than the sun. Life with Tom, Daniel, and Michael found a comfortable rhythm. We became a real family. 2 years after the wedding, our lives changed again. We welcomed a baby girl, Emily. It was a warm spring morning. I held her in my arms as Tom, Daniel, and Michael stood around my hospital bed, their faces radiant with joy and love. In that moment, I felt an incredible sense of completeness. I loved all 3 of my children equally, Daniel and Emily, my biological children, and Michael, my stepson. To me, they were united not by blood but by love. One evening, as Linda was settling the kids for dinner, a sound from the television caught our attention. On the screen, I saw my father's face. He stood on a podium, waving to a cheering crowd. The headline read, "John Williams announces mayoral candidacy." My heart froze. Years had passed since I last saw my parents, even if only on a screen. My father looked older, his hair was almost entirely gray, but his eyes still held the same stern gaze I remembered from childhood. He was speaking about family values and morality, his voice strong and confident. Aunt Linda abruptly turned off the TV, her face contorted with anger. "Hypocrites," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. I turned to her, shocked by her outburst. "Aunt Linda, what's going on?" She took a deep breath, her eyes still fixed on the now dark screen. "Abigail, there's something you need to know. Something they've hidden for years." Her words struck like a bolt of lightning. Linda revealed that, many years ago, before I was born, my parents had another child, a boy born with severe physical disabilities, including missing legs. Instead of accepting him, they left him at the hospital, afraid he would bring them shame. A whirlwind of emotions overtook me: shock, disbelief, deep sadness. How could they? Why had I never known about this? Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, struggling to hold back tears. "I'm sorry, Abigail," Linda replied, her eyes glistening. "I should have told you, but after what they did to you, I couldn't bear to add to your pain." That night, after the children had gone to bed, I sat alone, grappling with the revelation. Somewhere out there was my brother, a person who had never known the love of his parents or the warmth of a family. I couldn't stay indifferent. With Tom's support, I made a decision: I had to find him. We hired a private investigator, and the search began. Weeks of waiting passed as the detective worked, and finally, there was a breakthrough. It turned out my brother was alive. More than that, despite his difficult start in life, he had thrived. He had been adopted by a wealthy family who gave him everything my parents were too afraid or unwilling to provide. His name was James, and he had become a successful writer. He was married, had 2 children, and seemed to lead a full and happy life. My first meeting with James is something I will never forget. It was a moment filled with both excitement and surreality. His warm smile and open arms broke through the barriers of time and unfamiliarity. Despite our physical differences, I saw traces of myself in him, and that immediately made him feel like family. "I always knew I had biological family somewhere," he said, his voice quiet but confident. "I just never expected to find a sister." We spent hours talking, sharing stories of our lives. James turned out to be an incredibly wise and kind person, whose resilience was inspiring. Over the following weeks and months, we grew even closer. I introduced him to Tom, Daniel, Michael, and little Emily, and in turn, He introduced us to his wife, Sarah, a coincidence that amused both of us, and their 2 children. Our family grew larger and stronger. 20 years had passed since that fateful day I was thrown out of my home. Life had brought its share of joys and sorrows, but I was grateful for every moment. Daniel, now 19, had just started college on a baseball scholarship. He had grown into a smart, kind, and confident young man. I was proud of him in ways words couldn't express. One lazy Sunday afternoon, I was scrolling through the news on my tablet when a familiar face caught my eye, my father. In the photo, he looked older, his hair was almost completely gray, but there was still a trace of the arrogance I remembered from my childhood. The headline read, "Mayor John Williams discusses family values in exclusive interview." Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked play. The video began with him talking about the importance of family integrity, morality, and traditional values. I listened, feeling bitterness rise within me. Then the interviewer asked about his children. My father's face softened, and for a moment, I saw the expression he always wore in public, a mix of feigned compassion and performative virtue. "I have a daughter, Sarah," he said with affected tenderness. "She is the light of our lives. But, unfortunately, we lost 2 of our children. That pain never goes away, but it has made our family stronger." I nearly dropped the tablet. Anger and disappointment surged through me like a storm. How dare he? How dare they erase me and James from their lives, from their story, and then use our loss to bolster their image? I closed the tablet, feeling a quiet yet resolute fury ignite within me. As if fate had orchestrated the timing, James called that evening. "Abigail, guess what? I'll be signing books in our hometown next week. It would mean the world to me if you could come." "I wouldn't miss it for anything," I replied, already feeling a plan taking shape in my mind. The following week, I found myself back in my childhood town. Walking through the familiar streets, memories washed over me in waves. Some were painful, but I refused to let them take hold of me. Instead, I focused on what I needed to do. The book signing where James was appearing buzzed with energy. A long line of people waited to meet him, shake his hand, and get his autograph. I took a place at the back of the line, feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. When it was my turn, I stepped forward, but before James could say anything, I turned to address the audience. "Mom, Dad, please stay," my voice rang out unexpectedly confident, filling the room that had been buzzing with tension moments ago. All eyes, including theirs, turned toward me. My heart pounded, but I knew the time had come. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation, don't you?" I continued, striving to keep my voice steady. They froze in place, their faces a mix of shock and fear. Caught in the gaze of the entire audience, they had no choice but to remain. Slowly, almost unwillingly, they sank back into their seats. I took a deep breath, feeling a tremor run through me, but I didn't let it stop me. "Many of you knew me when I was growing up," I began, addressing the crowd. "You knew my family. But there's so much you didn't know. So much that's been hidden for far too long." My voice trembled, but as I continued, it grew stronger, as though years of pain and suppressed emotions had finally found their release. "This is my brother, James," I said, gesturing toward him as the audience's eyes shifted to him. "He was abandoned at a hospital as a baby. He was abandoned because of his physical condition, so he wouldn't become a shame. My parents hid his existence while building their reputation on lies. But the story didn't end there. It happened again." I paused, scanning the room. Faces reflected shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, outright disapproval. But I pressed on, feeling the weight of my words carve through the space around me. When I became pregnant at 18, my parents didn't offer support or understanding. They demanded I have an abortion. Doctors warned that it might leave me unable to have children, but they didn't care. When I refused, they threw out their pregnant daughter, to protect their precious reputation. My words grew louder, richer with emotion. I saw journalists scribbling notes, attendees whispering among themselves. And all these years, I continued, they've spoken about family values and morality. But their actions tell a different story. They abandoned 2 of their children when we needed them the most. They erased us from their lives to preserve their image. The room erupted into noise, escalating into chaos. Some people began shouting accusations at my parents, while others argued with their neighbors. Journalists, who had arrived expecting a routine book signing event, were now frantically calling editors or jotting down notes. Amid the commotion, I locked eyes with my father. His face, once strong and confident, now looked gaunt and defeated. He seemed small, almost pitiful. My mother, who always maintained her composure, was openly crying. Sarah sat beside them, her face frozen in shock and confusion. In the days that followed, the story spread across local news and then gained national attention. My father's political career collapsed almost instantly. The man who had preached honesty and family values was exposed as a hypocrite of the highest order. His position as mayor became untenable, and within a week, he resigned, citing personal reasons. Everyone knew what that meant. The college where he taught hurriedly distanced itself from the scandal, terminating his contract. Amid the chaos, one thing became clear: my sister Sarah had made her choice. She stood firmly by my parents. She refused to acknowledge the truth. "You've ruined everything," she hissed during a brief phone call. "Don't ever contact me again. You're as dead to me as you are to Mom and Dad." Her words cut like a knife. Even after everything, I had hoped she might open her eyes. But I was wrong. Life has a strange way of throwing unexpected twists when you least expect them. Just a few days after my confrontation, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a number I hadn't seen in over 20 years. On the other end was Jake, the man I had long erased from my life. His voice sounded hesitant, almost sheepish. "Abigail, it's me," he began, as if afraid I would hang up immediately. "I've been thinking about us, about what happened." I said nothing, letting him continue. "Sarah and we can't have children. I was thinking, maybe, we have a son, and we could be a family." His words hit like a hammer. But instead of anger or hurt, I laughed. The sound surprised even me. It was filled with disbelief and astonishment. "Jake," I finally said, almost smirking, "you made your choice 20 years ago. You abandoned me when I was pregnant with your child. You married my sister. And now, just because you can't have children with her, you think you can waltz back into my life? No. That's not how this works." "But, Abigail, No, Jake," I interrupted firmly. "I have a wonderful husband and a beautiful family. I don't need you, and I certainly don't want you in our lives. Goodbye." I hung up, feeling an unexpected sense of closure. It was a moment I hadn't realized I needed. Finally, I had said everything I had carried with me for years. But the surprises weren't over yet. The next day, I received another call. This time, the voice on the other end belonged to a woman. "Abigail?" she asked hesitantly. "This is Martha, Jake's mother. We just found out about Daniel. Is it true we have a grandson?" Her voice trembled. The words sounded as if they were difficult for her to say. It turned out that Jake and my parents had lied to them. They were told I had an abortion and ran away from home. They had spent years believing their grandson had never existed. "We'd love to meet him," Martha said, her voice full of emotion. "If that's okay with you. Of course, we'll understand if you don't want us in your lives." I paused to think. These people weren't responsible for Jake's actions or the lies of my parents. They, too, had been victims of deception. "All right," I said at last. "I'll talk to Daniel and see if he's open to meeting you." When I discussed it with Daniel, he responded with the maturity and compassion that never ceased to amaze me. He agreed, saying he'd like to get to know his grandparents. The meeting went surprisingly well. There were tears, hugs, and a lot of stories to catch up on. Martha and her husband embraced Daniel as if they were afraid to let go. He welcomed them with open arms, genuine and sincere. In the months that followed, our lives settled into a new normal. James and his family became regular visitors at our home, filling it with laughter and love. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob, as always, treated all our children equally, regardless of biological ties. Our home was full of warmth and joy. As for my parents and Sarah, I occasionally heard snippets of news. After the scandal, they left town, trying to escape the shame. Part of me felt pity for them, but I knew I had done the right thing by telling the truth. Their lies had destroyed too many lives, and their departure felt like the fitting end to that chapter. My family became my source of strength. We had faced many trials, but love and honesty had seen us through.